Have you ever felt that constant pressure, that inner voice insisting that you need to be better than others to have value? That your life only makes sense when you are ahead, when you outperform your colleagues, your friends, even strangers on social media? This is a peculiarly modern feeling, but with deep roots in our evolutionary history. We live in a culture obsessed with rankings, with comparison metrics, with success stories defined by the ability to leave others behind. And at the same time, we have never been so unhappy, so anxious, so disconnected from what truly matters. This paradox defines our era. The more we try to surpass others, the more we destroy the possibility of a genuinely meaningful life. Today, I want to explore with you this curious mechanism, this cultural and psychological trap in which billions of us are caught, often without realizing it. The idea that to be successful, we necessarily need to be better than others. We will examine the origins of this belief, how it is programmed into our brains and societies, why it rarely leads us to the happiness it promises, and, more importantly, how we can find a different path. To understand why the obsession with surpassing others has become so central in our lives, we need to go back in time, not just a few decades, but thousands, even millions of years. Our hominid ancestors evolved in small social groups where relative status mattered greatly for survival and reproduction. Those who achieved higher positions in the social hierarchy had prioritized access to scarce resources such as food and partners. In the ancestral environment, being surpassed by others could literally mean the difference between surviving or not, between passing on your genes or seeing them disappear from the face of the earth. It is not surprising, therefore, that our brains developed powerful mechanisms of social comparison. Our ancestors, who cared intensely about their relative position in the group, tended to have better chances of surviving and reproducing than those indifferent to their comparative status. This evolutionary mechanism continued to manifest in the first human civilizations. In agricultural societies, the social hierarchy became even more formalized, with explicit systems of castes, nobility, slavery. A person's identity and value were determined almost exclusively by their relative position in the social pyramid. Kings and nobles not only lived materially better lives, but were considered intrinsically superior, often with some divine connection that justified their dominance over others. Even in religions, salvation was often presented as a competition. Only the most devoted, the purest, the ones who followed the rules most strictly, would earn paradise. The others would be left behind, or worse, condemned eternally. With the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern capitalism, this tendency toward competitive comparison did not disappear. It merely transformed. Merit apparently replaced birth as the criterion determining who rises and who falls on the social ladder. But this only intensified psychological pressure. When social position is supposedly based on individual merit, failing to succeed becomes a much more painful personal flaw. In traditional societies, a peasant could at least blame the system or fate for their position. In modern meritocratic society, we are taught that each person gets what they deserve. If you are lower on the hierarchy, there must be something fundamentally wrong with you. The 20th century saw this tendency accelerate dramatically. The rise of celebrity culture, professional sports, university rankings, richest lists, workplace performance metrics, all of this created endless opportunities for social comparison. And the result was not a society of happy winners, but an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness. Even those at the top of the pyramid rarely find the lasting satisfaction they expected. Because in the game of surpassing others, the finish line is always moving. There is always someone new to surpass, a new milestone to reach, a new status indicator to chase. And now, in the 21st century, social media has taken our tendency for social comparison to unprecedented levels. We are no longer just comparing ourselves with our neighbors or co-workers. We are comparing ourselves with a highly edited and curated version of the lives of billions of people around the world. Every post, every like, every follower becomes a new metric by which we measure our relative value. Algorithms designed to maximize our engagement do so precisely by feeding our insecurities, our need for validation, our fear of falling behind. Technology has also allowed us to quantify and compare almost every aspect of our lives. Apps track how many steps we take, how many calories we burn, how much sleep we get, how productive we are. Every aspect of our existence becomes an opportunity for competition, to prove ourselves better than others, or more often, to discover that we are falling behind. But here is the central paradox. The more intensely we pursue surpassing others, the less likely we are to live a life that truly matters. And this happens for several deep reasons that we rarely acknowledge. First, the obsession with surpassing others disconnects us from our own authentic values and desires. Instead of asking, what truly matters to me? What brings me genuine satisfaction? We begin to ask, what will make me look good in the eyes of others? What will lift me in the social hierarchy? And so gradually, we lose contact with our inner compass. We pursue careers, relationships, possessions, and experiences, not because they resonate with our deepest being, but because they carry status value in our culture. Think, for example, of how many talented students enter medical, law, or business schools, not because they are passionate about these fields, but because they are socially prestigious and financially rewarding. Or how many professionals remain in jobs they secretly hate because they fear appearing like failures if they choose a different path, potentially less lucrative or recognized. There is a deep irony here. By focusing on surpassing others, we often end up living someone else's life. We live according to values and goals we internalize from our culture, from our parents, from our peers, but which may have little to do with who we truly are. And thus, even when we achieve success in the eyes of the world, we feel a strange inner emptiness, as if we had reached the top of a ladder only to discover that it was leaning against the wrong wall. The second problem with striving to surpass others is that it places us in a zero-sum game with our peers. When we define success as being above, it necessarily means others must be below. This transforms other people from potential allies and sources of connection into threats and competitors. Social life becomes an arena of constant competition instead of a refuge of collaboration and belonging. This mindset corrodes our ability to have genuine relationships. If we are always evaluating where we stand relative to others, we can never be truly present with them. There will always be a layer of strategic calculation in our interactions. We will always be, consciously or unconsciously, comparing our status to theirs and adjusting our behavior accordingly. This fundamentally distrustful and self-protective stance makes true vulnerability and authentic intimacy impossible. Moreover, psychological research consistently shows that frequent social comparisons are associated with lower levels of well-being, higher anxiety, and higher rates of depression. This makes sense. If your sense of self-worth depends on being above others, you live in constant fear of being surpassed. And in a world of more than 8 billion people, there will always be someone smarter, more attractive, richer, or more successful in some specific aspect. Therefore, any satisfaction you derive from temporarily being ahead will inevitably be fragile and short-lived. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, the obsession with surpassing others distorts our relationship with time. When we are focused on comparisons, we live perpetually in the future, always anticipating the next milestone, the next achievement that will finally prove our worth. Or we live in the past, ruminating over previous failures, missed opportunities, moments when others surpassed us. What we rarely do is fully inhabit the present, the only dimension of time in which life actually happened. Hunter-gatherer societies, people lived much more in the present. Certainly, they planned for the near future, preparing for seasonal changes or potential scarcities, but there was no modern notion of a career unfolding over decades. There was no idea that someone's value was tied to continuous linear progress, always climbing some invisible ladder of success. With the emergence of agriculture and later industrialization, our temporal orientation began to shift. Societies developed more elaborate notions of progress, both individual and collective. The future became not only something to prepare for, but a repository of hopes, dreams, and increasingly greater aspirations. Planning a career, building a legacy, accumulating wealth for future generations, all these ideas gained central importance. And with modern capitalism, this orientation toward the future intensified dramatically. Now we are constantly encouraged to sacrifice the present for the future, work hard now for a promotion later, save now for retirement later, study now for a better career later. Always later, 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 as if real life were perpetually postponed, always on the horizon, never here and now. The irony, of course, is that the future never arrives as such. When the future, for which we sacrifice so much, finally becomes the present, we rarely experience it fully because we are already focused on the next future. And so, paradoxically, in trying to secure a successful life in the future, we end up not truly living at any moment. As I write these words, I am aware that it may seem like I am suggesting that all ambition, every desire for improvement is problematic. that is not the case. The problem is not the desire to grow, to develop, to accomplish meaningful things in the world. The problem is when that desire is driven primarily by social comparison, by the imperative to surpass others, rather than by some genuine internal impulse. I want to pause for a moment to ask, do you also feel this tension in your daily life? This constant pressure to compare and compete, even intuitively, knowing that it rarely leads to real happiness. I know it can be difficult to put into words. Many of us carry this weight in silence, believing we are the only ones who feel this particular emptiness while we relentlessly chase success. But you are not alone in this. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, I feel this pressure to outperform others when, filling it in with your personal experience. Your comment may be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel that they are not alone in their struggle. Sometimes, naming what we feel is the first step to transforming it. Returning to our theme, perhaps the clearest example of this phenomenon is our society's relationship with money and material status. Modern capitalism is based on the premise that continuous economic growth is not only possible but necessary. And on an individual level, this translates into the expectation that we must continuously increase our income, expand our possessions, improve our lifestyle. Success is implicitly defined as having more than we had before, and more importantly, more than others have now. But research on happiness and well-being consistently shows that beyond a certain point of basic material security, more money and possessions rarely translate into more happiness. In fact, societies that have become much richer in recent decades have not seen corresponding increases in self-reported happiness levels. In many cases, we have seen the opposite: rising anxiety, depression, loneliness, and loss of meaning. That is because many of the things that most contribute to genuine human well-being are not positional or comparative by nature. Deep relationships, a sense of meaning and purpose, connection with something larger than ourselves, moments of flow and total engagement, the appreciation of beauty, creative expression, none of these things fundamentally depend on being better than others. There is a crucial difference between what we might call positional goods and non-positional goods. Positional goods derive their value primarily from where they place us in the social hierarchy. They are inherently scarce because not everyone can be at the top. If everyone has a luxury car, the luxury car loses its value as a status marker. Non-positional goods, on the other hand, derive their value from their intrinsic qualities, not from how they position us relative to others. The love of a friend or family member, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful or useful, the feeling of being in harmony with nature, none of these experiences become less valuable because others have them too. In fact, they often become more valuable when shared. Our society, however, encourages us to disproportionately focus on positional goods. Advertising, social media, even our educational systems all emphasize the importance of standing out, surpassing, impressing. We are rarely encouraged to reflect on what truly brings us joy and lasting meaning, regardless of how it compares to the experiences of others. Moreover, the emphasis on surpassing others often leads us to adopt an instrumental view of the activities we engage in, instead of valuing an activity for itself, for its intrinsic pleasure or meaning. We value it for what it can do for our social status. We play an instrument not primarily for the pleasure of music, but to impress others with our skill. We exercise not mainly for well-being and the joy of movement, but to have a body that evokes envy. We read books not mainly for the love of learning and ideas, but to appear cultured and informed in social conversations. And by adopting this instrumental approach to life, we inadvertently drain the pleasure and meaning from our experiences, because the deepest pleasure and meaning often come precisely from being totally immersed in an activity for its own sake, losing ourselves in it, temporarily forgetting ourselves and how we are being perceived. Think, for example, of how a small child plays. They are not concerned with looking good or being better than other children. They are completely absorbed in the activity itself, fully present without self-consciousness. And it is precisely this quality of total engagement that makes children's play so joyful. As we grow, we gradually lose this ability to engage without self-consciousness. We become increasingly concerned with how we appear, how we compare, whether we are doing well. And thus, paradoxically, we often become less capable of genuine excellence, precisely because we are so concerned with being excellent. Another problematic aspect of the surpass others mentality is how it leads us to internalize our successes and failures in ways that are deeply harmful to our self-esteem and psychological resilience. When we see life as a competition, we tend to interpret setbacks not as temporary learning experiences, but as verdicts on our fundamental worth as people. If we do not get the promotion, if our relationship ends, if our business fails, if our book does not sell, we tend to see this not merely as a specific outcome in a specific context, but as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy within us. I lost because I'm not good enough. Others are inherently superior to me. This tendency toward excessive internalization makes us extraordinarily vulnerable. Our sense of self-worth swings dramatically based on external outcomes that are often largely beyond our control. We are constantly on edge because we know that the next failure could confirm our worst fears about ourselves. This makes us risk-averse, less willing to try new things, less able to bounce back after inevitable failures. In contrast, those who define success in non-comparative terms, in terms of personal growth or fidelity to their own values, tend to be much more resilient. They can see failures as data, as useful information, as learning opportunities, not as sentences about their intrinsic worth. The most insidious aspect of the obsession with surpassing others, however, may be how it distorts our notion of community and the common good. When everyone is primarily concerned with climbing the social ladder, the very fabric of trust and solidarity that keeps societies together begins to unravel. Healthy societies are built on a shared sense of common destiny, on the understanding that individual and collective well-being are intrinsically intertwined. But the competitive mindset leads us to see the success of others as somehow diminishing our own. Instead of celebrating when our fellow citizens thrive, we may secretly resent their success, seeing it as a threat to our relative status. This kind of thinking manifests in our politics, where we increasingly see public issues, not in terms of seeking solutions that benefit everyone, but in terms of zero-sum games, where one group's gain must necessarily come at the expense of another. It manifests in our workplaces, where genuine collaboration is undermined by competition for promotions and recognition. It manifests in our schools, where learning for the love of knowledge is overshadowed by the race for grades and rankings. On a more personal level, this mentality prevents us from experiencing one of the most deeply satisfying pleasures available to human beings: the pleasure of contributing to the well-being of others with no expectation of return or recognition. Research consistently shows that acts of selfless generosity are among the most powerful sources of lasting happiness. But when we are trapped in a mindset of competition and comparison, we struggle to see value in actions that do not directly increase our status or relative position. Given all these problems, how can we begin freeing ourselves from the trap of defining success in terms of surpassing others? How can we find motivation and purpose without relying on social comparison? The first step, perhaps, is simply to become aware of how much our current thinking is shaped by social comparisons. How many of our decisions, big and small, are influenced by considerations of how they will position us in the eyes of others? How many of our daily emotions are responses to perceiving ourselves as ahead or behind on various social measures? Only by bringing this dynamic into consciousness can we begin to question it and potentially choose something different. The second step is to begin developing alternative metrics of success, metrics that do not depend on comparisons with others. For example, instead of asking, "Am I more successful than my peers?" we could ask, "Am I growing and improving relative to myself in the past?" Instead of, "Is my home more impressive than my neighbors?" we could ask, "Does this space truly reflect my values and facilitate the kind of life I want to live?" This does not mean abandoning all ambition or desire for excellence. It means reorienting that ambition away from comparative social position and toward alignment with our deepest values and the development of our unique potential. A third step is to diversify the sources from which we derive our sense of self-worth and identity. When we define ourselves exclusively by a single dimension, such as career or appearance or material wealth, we are especially vulnerable to status anxiety. If that single source of identity is threatened, we feel as if our entire being is at stake. In contrast, those who cultivate multiple facets of identity, multiple sources of meaning and value, tend to be much more resilient. If you are not just a successful professional, but also a loyal friend, an active member of the community, a person with diverse interests and passions, then setbacks in any specific area do not threaten your entire sense of self. A fourth step, and perhaps the most challenging, is to begin actively practicing what Buddhists call sympathetic joy, or what in Portuguese we call rejoicing in the happiness of others. This is the ability to feel genuine pleasure in the success and happiness of others, to see their triumphs not as something that diminishes our own status, but as something that adds beauty and goodness to the world. This is a radical practice in a culture so deeply committed to competition. It requires us to challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about how value and success work. But those who cultivate this capacity often find that it is extraordinarily liberating. Suddenly, the success of others is no longer a threat to be feared, but an additional source of joy and celebration. A fifth step is to cultivate a longer and broader perspective on our lives and our place in the world. Concern with social status tends to keep us focused on very short time horizons, on the immediate rises and falls of prestige and position. But when we take a step back and consider the longer arc of a human life, or the tiny yet precious place we occupy in the vast expanse of the cosmos, our concerns with outdoing others often seem surprisingly small and irrelevant. This is not an exercise in self-mortification, of telling ourselves that we are insignificant and that nothing we do matters. On the contrary, it is a reminder that what truly makes our lives meaningful rarely has anything to do with where we stand in various social hierarchies. What matters, in the end, is the quality of our presence, the depth of our connections, the integrity of our actions, the love we give and receive, the difference we make, even if small, to those around us. The question then is not whether we should strive for excellence or growth. It is why we do so and how we define what it means to succeed in this pursuit. When our motivation comes mainly from the desire to surpass others, to prove our worth by comparison, we condemn ourselves to a life of anxiety, dissatisfaction, and superficial human connections. But when our motivation comes from a sense of intrinsic purpose, from alignment with our deepest values, from a desire to develop our unique gifts and contribute to the greater good, we discover a far more sustainable source of meaning and satisfaction. Of course, making this shift is not easy in a culture so deeply committed to competition and social comparison. The systems in which we live, from schools to workplaces, from social media to politics, are all structured to reinforce the mentality of outdoing others. Swimming against this current requires not only individual reflection and clarity, but also supportive communities, deliberate practices, and ideally, changes in the very systems that shape our incentives and shared values. But the effort is worth it, because the paradox is that by abandoning the obsession with surpassing others, we often become more capable of genuine excellence, more resilient in the face of challenges, more connected with others and with ourselves, more present to the joys and wonders of everyday life. Life becomes not an endless ladder to be climbed, but a path to be lived fully, moment by moment. And so, perhaps the question is not how can I surpass others, but how can I live in a way that honors the uniqueness of my path while also honoring the uniqueness of the paths of others? How can I contribute my unique gifts in a way that uplifts not only myself, but everyone around me? How can I measure success not in terms of comparison, but in terms of alignment with my deepest values and service to the greater good? These are not easy questions to answer. They require continuous reevaluation, a willingness to honestly examine our motivations and choices, an openness to challenge deeply ingrained cultural assumptions. But as we engage with these questions, we begin to loosen the knots that keep us trapped in the cycle of social comparison and incessant competition. And as we do so, we may discover a form of ambition that does not leave us exhausted and alienated, but energizes and connects us. A way of pursuing excellence that comes not from fear of inadequacy, but from love for what we do and for those we serve. A way of living that honors both our uniqueness and our fundamental interdependence with all other beings. This kind of transformation does not happen overnight. It is a journey, not a destination. There will be moments when we find ourselves slipping back into old thought habits based on comparison. Moments when status anxiety takes hold again. The important thing is to notice when this happens, bring it to awareness, and gently redirect our attention to what truly matters. And what truly matters, in the end, are the connections we form, the love we share, the difference we make, the person we become along the way, not where we stand in some imaginary hierarchy of success or failure, but how present we are to the beauty and terror, the joy and sorrow, the mystery and miracle of being alive in this singular moment, in this singular world. If these reflections have touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with greater wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. Returning to our initial theme, the paradox of surpassing others, perhaps the deeper truth is this: a truly successful life cannot be measured in comparative terms, because each of us is unique with distinct gifts, challenges, circumstances, purposes, and paths. Competing with others is fundamentally a category error, as if an apple tree were trying to produce the best oranges or a bird trying to be the best fish. Authentic success is not about being better than others, but about being the most truly, fully, and magnificently yourself that you can be, contributing your unique gifts, living in accordance with your deepest values, being a presence of love and wisdom in a world that desperately needs both. In this sense, the only other we need to surpass is that version of ourselves that forgot what truly matters, that is trapped in the cycle of comparison and competition that measures worth in terms of relative status rather than intrinsic meaning. And the miracle is that as we make this internal shift, we often discover a form of excellence more authentic, sustainable, and satisfying than anything we could have found on the path of incessant competition. We discover that, paradoxically, the path to a truly extraordinary life lies not in trying to be special or superior, but in fully embracing our common humanity, our shared vulnerability, our fundamental interdependence with all other beings. It is there, in that ground of genuine connection, that we find not only relief from the chronic anxiety of social comparison, but also the deep and lasting joy that comes from being fully alive, fully present, fully engaged in the miracle and mystery of existence.
You don't have children. Is part of the reason you don't have children because you are fearful for the future?
No, it's not a conscious decision. I just never really thought about it. It's not
That's
something
so refreshing to hear.
It's just, sometimes I tell people it's the same way I don't have an elephant. I just never thought about it.
I love that. I've never had that response. I'm someone who doesn't have children, and that's just such a wonderful thing to hear. Thank you, Yuval.
Another story is about Tiberius, the Roman Emperor Tiberius. He was afraid to be assassinated, like all emperors. Unfortunately for him, the commander of his bodyguard, Sejanus, was an extremely ambitious person also. Sejanus convinced Tiberius to move to live on the small island of Capri, telling Tiberius that there he will be safer, because it would be easier to protect him against assassins and spies and so forth. And Tiberius moved to live in Capri. But then Sejanus controlled all the information that reached the emperor. It was very easy for him. But nobody could get to Capri. No letter could reach the emperor unless it passed through the hands of the bodyguards. And Sejanus became the real ruler of the Roman Empire because he controlled all the information reaching Tiberius. And if somebody tried to make a move against him, he could always tell Tiberius that this person was conspiring against him or was a threat and should be eliminated. And to some extent, this is true of all of us. All of us can find ourselves isolated on an island, maybe a digital island, and whoever controls the information that reaches our ears and eyes control us.
How do you get to know your own mind? I practice Vipassana meditation. When I just began practicing, I became like this missionary. Everybody must go. And after some years of just, from empirical observation, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Find out what works for you, and then whatever it is. It can be a different tradition of meditation. It can be therapy. It can be art. It can be sport. It can be going to the woods for a period. Whatever works for you, and then invest in it. And it is, in many ways, the most important thing you can give yourself.